Welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. This week we'll have our second seminar for a student presentation for their work that they presented at TRB. Today we have Travis Glick and Steve Howland from CE and a USP program respectively. They will present on topic estimating reliability index for transit and traffic, as well as Equitable bike sharing program. Again, each of them will have 20 minutes for presentation, followed by about 10 minutes for Q&A. And then if we have a little bit of time left in the end, we'll open up for questions for either or both of them. Okay, we'll start with Travis. With that, I'll give the floor to Travis.
Hello, everyone. My name is Travis Glick. I am a second-year master's student in the engineering program here. Been working in the transportation lab for a couple of years now, started as an undergrad, working with high-resolution archive transit data. So, done a lot since I started, but today we're going to share with you some of the more interesting things we've been working on in the last year. So, I'll start with explaining what is high-resolution data to those of you who are not familiar, where it comes from, how it's collected, go into the methodology for how we did this particular study for the reliability indexes and confidence intervals, do speed and travel time diagrams with those confidence intervals, show you what we can learn from them, space-time and speed diagrams, and then a few other applications that are possible that can give insights into a route that you're looking at. So to begin, this is Powell Blvd. Not all of it, just the red portion that is horizontal. It is a major arterial that connects the city of Gresham to the Portland city center, carries upwards of 40,000 vehicles daily. It's also a major commuter route along Route 9. So we will be looking at the segment in the box that has 30 stops in each direction, give or take, and 15 signalized intersections. It has 2 lanes in each direction and is pretty uniform along its length, making it a good candidate to study. So high-resolution data comes from transit agencies. TriMet was one of the first to implement this system. They have been using it since 2013, collecting data on all of their buses in 5-second intervals. So every 5 seconds, as the bus is moving, it drops a timestamp and a GPS coordinate. It's a very large archive that you can learn a lot about from just time and position data. So, for an example, take this hypothetical segment. As the buses are traveling, they're dropping their GPS coordinates and their timestamps. Note, for this analysis, we had 1,000 buses, not 3. We used 3 weeks of data in November from 2014. So, when you're looking at this, you want to know what's going on. So take 150 feet. We then pick 1 point from each bus that was dropped before the coordinate we're looking at and 1 point after. We can then use that information to calculate speed for that segment, and then using the 1,000 buses, we can then calculate averages. Moving it along in different intervals, we can gain information along the route, again using a point before and a point after. Some points change, some do not. But considering the extremely large sample size, it gives us some good information. For those of you who like numbers, we're using a set of buses, and each bus has a set of points that drops along the route. We are looking at segments, and so we take that 5-mile segment along Powell, we divided it into 25-foot intervals, and then picked a center point of each interval. That center point was used to define the points before and the points after, which gave us a set of speeds, which we use the harmonic mean to calculate because it is more accurate for transit data. It allows you to not overestimate high speeds in these small segments. For confidence, using this large sample size, we were able to pick an alpha, say 0.05, use that score to calculate standard deviations of given percentiles from this data set, and then use that to calculate the range of points that would be likely within that. So 95% confidence that our value falls within the values that we calculated. But we did one more step, and this is a really important one, is we wanted to know what was happening for points that were around bus stops as well for general traffic. Because when you're looking at general traffic, they're not stopping at bus stops, and it makes a big difference. And so we went into a different data set, stop-level data, and figured out which buses were stopping based on their dwell time. Took that dwell time and compared it to the same bus and the same coordinates to remove points from buses that stop immediately surrounding bus stops. This gives us a reasonable idea of what is happening for general traffic. There's one complication in it, which I'll go into a little bit later. So, first we'll look at speed percentiles and travel times. So what you're looking at is the 5th percentile, very slow buses. But specifically, there's a lot going on. So this is an example, so I can show you what you're looking at. First this is when you're using all the data. And on the other side, the data once those bus stop related points have been removed. Up top, you're looking at speed, and on the bottom, travel time. The width of the lines is your 95th percentile confidence interval that the speed is within that. The percentile is labeled, as is the direction of travel, in this case westbound, so traveling from 205 to the crest of the Ross Island Bridge. On the top, for all data, we labeled bus stops. These are the most important points in this data set because they're where the bus is slowing down frequently and where their primary influence is. Once we remove those, it changes, and instead we labeled the signalized intersections, with one exception, the 17th merge. And the 17th merge is important. It's not a signalized intersection, but its effect shows up clearly in some of the data that we're looking at. So then we can run this analysis for percentiles along the entire route and see how things change for different buses statistically. We will be focusing on just 3 of these, the 15th, the 50th, and the 85th percentile, which represent your general congestion, your median travel time, and a general free flow speed of traffic. For the 15th, first thing to look at is some of the differences between the first data set and the one where dwell has been removed by looking at this segment, where you can see dips associated with bus stops that aren't showing up in the other data, which more clearly reflects what will be going on for general traffic. Your travel times are notably different, almost 10 minutes difference between the buses and the general traffic. Again, they're not stopping. This is to be expected. But the same trends still show up in the data. As we move to the 15th percentile, looking, say, at all of the data for both, there are a couple of points which I've marked which will go away as you move to the 50th percentile. These points right there are locations where your median bus is not going to be stopping to serve passengers. Nobody is asking to get on, nobody is asking to get off. And it makes a big difference. The travel times are much closer, just a couple of minutes off. But there are still differences. Looking over where in the segment highlighted in purple, this is the effect of intersections. And so even though the effect on the other side of bus stops has been mostly removed, there are a list of intersections in a row that are changing things, but not as highly as it could be. And this is because your median bus is going to be hitting these intersections at a green light. And that would be expected on a major arterial with minor streets crossing. Moving to the 85th, the plots are very similar from the left side of your screen to the right. There are, of course, a few exceptions. Travel times are the same, almost. Few bus stops that are still being served pretty regularly. But you'll notice that there are still dips on the right-hand side, these 3 in particular. Now, this is where the time points come into play. And these time points are locations where the bus, when it's running early, will stop and wait before moving forward to try to get back on schedule. When that happens, normally it's serving passengers, you'll have an associated dwell time. But it doesn't always, because when the doors don't open, dwell time is not recorded in this particular data set. And so by using dwell time to determine which buses were stopping, we're left with a few locations where buses stopped but showed no dwell time. But once you know where they are, they can be removed. And so you can get an idea of what is happening for general traffic at your 85th percentile versus the buses. So moving on a bit to space-time and speed diagrams. I have a different picture in terms of what you can look at. So we've separated out by time of day on the y-axis, and then location, which is the same as the previous plots. A couple of things should jump out. First is you have this large patch of red, which is congestion in the morning as you move towards the Ross Island Bridge. Slow speeds of around 5 miles an hour for almost 2 miles for about an hour and a half. That's bad. You don't want that. But this clearly shows where it is. In the peak period PM, you also have congestion. It's not as extreme, but again, it still shows up. It's more spread out too. When you take this data, you'll also notice a bunch of vertical lines. These are the bus stops. If we want to look at general traffic, we need to take those away. And so what you're left with is a plot that more closely resembles what is happening for your general traffic. The peak is still there because this is everybody, with one exception, and it's here. And this is where the 17th merge comes in. This is a location where 17th Street does a flyover and then merges with Powell Boulevard. When this happens, it causes a lot of congestion and backup, but as soon as it happens, buses are exiting right into their own lane before moving on to a time point bus stop, which is the red line following. This is a location where using this methodology won't be effective to know what's happening for general traffic, because the buses aren't traveling with general traffic, but also highlights how effective these bus lanes can be, where you have this extreme congestion and then it vanishes. And so doing something like this can be highly effective. Also notice leading up to another time point, this all-day congestion. When you look at something like that, go, all right, what's causing this? We went in and looked at the intersection. It's the intersection of two major arterials where the buses are in the right-hand lane. There are only two. And they're being forced to wait behind right-turning vehicles, which are in turn being forced to wait for pedestrians. And the bus is trying to get to the far side, to its bus stop, and it's not being able to throughout most of the day. Looking at eastbound data, we have a different picture. You'll see there are no distinct red blotches. And once we remove the bus stops, there is some congestion, 15 miles an hour or so, that shows up during the PM peak as people are traveling away from the city center, but nothing as extreme as you're going to find in westbound. By looking at comparisons like this, you can try to figure out why is one direction operating poorly and the other one not. And it can help to identify problems. For some other applications, you can, for example, examine the difference between your general free flow speed and your general congestion to see which places are being affected. And one in particular, you'll notice that's this 80-second stop, which is easily the most used stop along this route, doesn't have as high a difference, and that's because it's being used all day. People are stopping at the stop 98% of the time, while other stops go away very quickly, where they're used just in the AM or PM peak and at no other time of day. You also have this right here, which is that morning congestion and evening congestion, where you're moving at 5 miles an hour during those times, but the rest of the time close to 45. And it shows just how different it can be. Once you remove the dwell times, left with a different picture. It's a bit noisy, but what remains is the effect of intersections and congestion leading up to intersections and less so after. You can also, again, do this by time of day, where we calculated percentiles for individual hours throughout the time of day and subtracted them, again, highlighting the points that are being the most affected. You can also look at the speed variability index, which is what you saw before divided by your median speed. And again, this highlights which places are going to be most extremely different. And so this is, again, highlighting the bus stops that are most used and the intersections which are most used. Again, by time of day, some of the intersections really stand out in this method. You have two intersections here, back to back, that are both fairly heavily used, causing congestion throughout most of the day, and then extremely high area of problem in the morning and evening. So, in conclusion, this allows us to identify congestion hotspots, look closer into areas where we need to examine it for more detail, figure out what's going on. This using both data sets, the high-resolution data set, which is newer, plus the more standard stop-level data, you can look at general traffic more accurately than has been able to be done in the past. Because by just using stop-level data, you still have the stops. But high-resolution data allows you to remove most of those stops and see what's happening. It can provide insights into which areas fluctuate the most throughout the day and allow you to examine infrastructure improvement areas. I'd like to thank NITSE for funding this research, and Steve Callis and Miles Crumley of TriMet for providing the definitions that we used, and of course to other researchers who helped lay the groundwork. Thank you.
Questions for Travis? If you're registered for the class, please announce your name.
Hi, my name is Dominic. I was curious about how you guys went about taking out the bus stops when it comes to calculating the miles per hour. So, was there like a maximum miles per hour that you used, and then just I don't know.
So when we were taking out the bus stops, we went and integrated the two data sets by using bus number, time of day, route number, and all other identifying features we could. If the bus had dwell, and that's doors opening, serving passengers, we went and took the points immediately before, so actually two of the high-resolution points that are before the GPS location of that stop for the bus that stopped, and then two after. So if it only stops once out of 1,000 buses, then our data set would have 1,000 buses here, 1,000 buses here, but 999 at that stop. Does that answer your question?
You mentioned that these data analysis methods can be used to solve problems and also kind of indicate where we need to take a closer look. What specific problems are you trying to solve with this data analysis?
I say solve problems. It can identify problems.
Okay.
This is mostly an identification method. For example, looking at where congestion is occurring all day long and isn't following standard commute patterns. As awful as that long congestion is in the morning and evening, it's a very different thing because that is to be expected. That is a standard travel pattern. But instead, you're looking at 82nd, which has congestion throughout the entire day. And so if you look at areas like that, which they shouldn't be behaving that way, you can then use that information to know where to look in more depth. Does that answer your question?
All right, came in late. You might have addressed this. I actually had the same question he had, but what if, imagine a scenario where all of your dwell times were during signal red on near side stops. Then there would be no difference between removing the stops or not. You're at a red light. So can you explain how you took into account how you assumed the bus was moving if it didn't stop? With respect to any kind of signal delay.
We did not assume that the bus was moving at different didn't stop. The way that we assumed in the data was if there was a dwell time, the bus stopped, and those data points had to be removed for that bus. And it was only for the bus stops. Now, if it is near an intersection, this will change the results that you get for the intersection. What we assumed was if there was no dwell, then the bus continued and we kept those data points. have that information. All that we were able to say is around bus stops. So I know that if the bus stopped and it served passengers, then those data points will not be in the data set without dwell. With, of course, the exception of time points, which did occasionally stop, waited, had long delays, but showed zero dwell.
Steve Kim. Is this method applicable in other contexts? Like, for example, like on a freeway where there isn't as many buses traveling, can you use it in, or is it only going to be inside an urban like area with signalized traffic and stops and stuff like that?
The main issue with the data set is, do you have the data? TriMet is one of just a handful of companies around the country that has high-resolution data. Some have it to, say, 30 seconds. Some have it to 10. So using this methodology is reliant on the data. If the buses are on the freeway and you have this data, it is applicable. If, again, that would be true for the lane the buses are traveling in. If there's a bus-only lane, you know how the buses are doing, but it's not great as a probe. And so if buses are traveling with traffic and you have the data, then this methodology can be used to look at general traffic.
Yes, Edgar. And you mentioned about a part that is exclusively for buses. How do you evaluate, just a neat question, if all this stretch were an exclusive lane for buses, how would be the impact for the travel time or for the general traffic?
Best we would be able to say is do a before and after study of when it was implemented versus without. That one location where you have the 17th merge, buses are exiting. It looks like they're doing fine. It looks like general traffic's doing fine, but they're not with the traffic, and so we don't know.
Is there some concern that you're representing the right lane on multi-lane arterials and not actually capturing general traffic?
Good question. So there have been other studies to look at how different travel speeds are in the two lanes, how buses compare to those. One of the things that this other study found is that the lanes are very similar when you're far away from a bus stop. They tend to behave similarly. But near a bus stop, they're not going to. So around bus stops, you are going to see a slight decrease in travel speeds, even if it's not serving passengers, because that's the behavior of the drivers. But when you're far away and you have removed buses that stopped, you're closer. Yes, this is the right lane for the most part. There are similarities that you can say between the two. They are comparable, but not perfect.
Two questions. One is, are there any express buses on this route that you looked at? And two is, does TriMet have this throughout the system? And are there efforts to kind of take a holistic look at kind of congestion throughout the city using this sort of an approach?
So there have been many studies done on congestion using transit data. This type of data is somewhat new. Part of my research moving forward is looking at multiple routes and comparing how it is being affected. Yes, there are attempts, but it's not widely implemented because it is new. Very little validation. But yes, TriMet has implemented this across their system. I don't think there are any express buses on Powell. Thus, that TriMet is looking at their bus rapid transit Powell division project. Which one of the issues is, of course, they know a lot of this congestion already. And unless they feel up to buying Cleveland High School plus a lot of other properties, they can't just go put in another lane.
Similar to the right lane question, but I wonder if you could speak a little to how you think the signal priority the buses are using would affect the ability to sort of transfer this to general traffic. So they're having maybe a different experience at intersections than an average car.
It's true. And it will. It will affect it. And until the data sets are integrated with priority, we won't know for certain. One thing that we can say about this route is that you are dealing with except for 82nd, the major road. And so for the most part, vehicles are going to be getting most of the priority. And we looked at signal timing without the buses. And Powell is favored everywhere except 82nd, where notably it has priority, but priority that is second to 82nd.
Great. Why don't we switch?
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stephen Howland. I'm a PhD candidate in Urban Studies and Planning here at Portland State. So what I'm presenting today is a study that I've worked on with co-authors Nathan McNeil, Joe Broach, John MacArthur, and Jennifer Dill. And this is a project that is part of a much larger project that we've been working on around bike share equity across the U.S. So this first piece is what I'm presenting today on, looking at a cursory glance of how bike share operators and owners across the U.S. are actually incorporating equity into their bike share programs. The rest of the project is looking at how programming in 3 particular cities is actually being implemented in low-income minority neighborhoods in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Brooklyn, and how their messaging and discount programs and such are actually operating and how these people are being affected. So I just want to start by going off of what exactly is equity. So when we look at equity, what is being discussed is kind of looking at what exactly are the disadvantages of these populations and how does that compare to other populations. So, looking at what efforts that are needed to actually correct this disadvantage. With this particular picture has made a lot of rounds around social media and in the equity market of, you have this difference between equality and equity of, you can do equality, give everybody a boost, but it doesn't affect everybody the same because you can still have people that experience a disadvantage unless you give enough of a boost to give them that boost above that barrier for the lowest common denominator. Whereas equity, you realize that you need a different boost to different populations based on what their disadvantage is. How we're applying this, when we sent out this survey to bike share owners and operators, we gave them some definitions from League of American Bicyclists and Advocacy Advance, basically telling them that, this is kind of how we're framing it. You have populations that are disadvantaged, and, you have many different groups of people. You have people of color, women, low-income populations, older adults. Any one of these populations can experience some kind of barrier when it comes to accessing bike share. So we wanted to prompt them with this idea that you need to think about people in different ways and think about what exactly it is that they're doing to help out any one of these populations or what they're doing to affect these populations altogether. So this particular photo is looking at, the same kind of concept, only you have this third option of just completely removing the barrier altogether rather than just providing a boost to people to get over that barrier. So this will come into play a little bit later when I'm discussing some of these things that we discovered from the survey that we gave. So to start off with, we identified bike share organizations based on multiple lists and web searches. We ended up compiling a list of 75 bike share systems across the U.S. and we excluded systems that had 40 bikes or fewer in their systems. This is to kind of take care of a lot of things of cities that are just getting into this, or are serving very small population segments or very specialized population segments. And we emailed the contact persons off this list in March 2016 and sent them 3 reminders. And we ended up getting 55 responses off of this. So got a pretty good response rate off of our 75 cities that we sent out the survey to. The structure of the survey, we first asked them, okay, what are your identifying characteristics? What kind of bike share system are you? How are you involved in this system? So are they owner of the system? Are they an operator of the system? What kind of system are they? Public, private, university-based, public-private partnership. There's all kinds of different organizational structures out there that we wanted to try to identify what exactly they were as their system. And we asked them, do they have an equity statement? So for the equity statement, we're asking them, do they have some kind of overarching idea of how they want to look at equity in their system? We'll show you some examples in a little bit on that. But we asked them, do they have one? And if they do have one, to provide us with that statement. Then we also asked them if they had any metrics that they were measuring to keep track of equity, or particular metrics that were focused around equity in their systems, and to provide us with those metrics. And probably the biggest piece of the survey was what role equity played in their systems. Now, this piece was asked them this question on what role it played, whether it was considered, whether it was not considered, whether it was considered and had what kind of impact it had on their planning around their system. And then it also gave them the opportunity to fill in how exactly equity was incorporated into that particular piece of their system. So we asked this around station siting, fee structure, and payment systems, system operations, promotion, outreach, and marketing, and data collection. And we also gave them the opportunity to provide us with perceived barriers that they had around around the users that they were targeting for their equity programs, and what barriers they had as an organization to actually achieving their equity goals. So we had 2 analyses techniques. One was ANOVA to use some of our very basic scale numbers to be able to compare, like size of the system versus the role of the equity pieces. I won't go into too many of those numbers, but we'll discuss some of those analyses. But the biggest piece here is the content analysis around their open-ended responses to how equity was involved, what their equity statements were. Overall, we had 200 codes that were identified. Our analyses mostly grouped a lot of those into common ideas around equity to be able to make the analysis a lot simpler. And this particular photo that's on the slide is a snapshot of the spreadsheet that we're using to identify those codes in the open-ended questions. So our respondents, we had 55 respondents. In this particular table, you'll see that universities are one part of our respondents. We had 4 respondents that were universities. We've excluded them from the analysis here because they serve such a specialized market, and equity is not applicable in the terms that we were wanting to look at. So we excluded them from the analysis a little bit later. But you can see that, for the most part, our survey captured a pretty equal split between owners, operators, and owner and operator type systems. We had a lot of government and nonprofit organizations, very few private operators, and most of our respondents had operational bike share systems, but we did have a few that were in pre-launch stages, and they provided some interesting insights on how they were approaching equity. And over half of our system respondents had between 100 to 500 bikes. And the rest were split between those that had fewer than 100 bikes and those that had 500 or more bikes. And the geographic dispersion across the U.S. was pretty even, except for the Northeast, which had very few system respondents. But it's also a matter of where these systems even exist to begin with. So to start to get into the equity statements, we had 13 systems that responded that they had equity statements. And a lot of them were saying that they don't, but we also had a small segment that said that they had other. So this other category was a lot of pending, so they were still in the process of developing their equity programming and such. But these 13 systems that say that they did have an equity statement, they were more likely to be large systems. They were more likely to be in cities that had a much higher diversity. And they tended to consider equity a lot more in their other decision-making in their system planning. Only 3 systems had equity statements that we considered extensive equity statements. So they were being much more specific in their statements of who they were targeting, how they were targeting, and specific goals that they wanted to achieve. So the difference between some of those versus non-specific or non-extensive statement is such as this quotation up at the top here, providing accessible and affordable bicycles for all. That's a particular goal that they have in mind, but it's not explicitly stating who exactly they're wanting to target or how they're wanting to target them. We had 33 systems that said that they didn't have an equity statement. These typically were smaller systems. They typically were in cities that were less racially diverse, and many say that they had equity statements that were in development. So they were starting to think about, many of them were starting to think about equity as a new kind of thing to them, and they were trying to figure out what exactly they wanted to do. One of the things that's important to note on these no equity statement systems is that the lack of an equity statement didn't impact their lack of equity planning throughout the other pieces of their system. And we'll see that as we go through a little bit. So you can see that having this chart here is showing you this difference between having an equity statement and not having an equity statement. So you can see that those that have equity statements were incorporating equity in many more pieces of their bike share system. So you have almost 60% of those that have equity statements had incorporated it in 3 to 5 elements of their system, whereas it's almost the flip side on those without equity statements not incorporating equity throughout their systems. So now we're going into the individual pieces of the bike share systems and how they incorporated equity. And you can see with this chart how what the most important pieces of the system that people that did incorporate equity were focusing on when they did incorporate equity. This is particularly around station siting and fee structures and payments. These are, in a lot of ways, kind of the low-hanging fruit of such. It's the most public pieces of your bike share equity programming because it factors into where your stations end up being located, and it ends up showing what kind of programming you're offering to your populations for discounted passes or different kinds of membership options and such. But we still had a lot of incorporation of equity and a lot of impact throughout the other pieces. So in station siting, there was a lot going on here and how they were thinking about what they were doing to incorporate equity for station siting. They were wanting to use station siting for equity purposes to help their targeted equity populations connect to jobs, connect to commercial and retail districts, and connect to recreation. Station placement, they were also focusing station placement on public housing complexes. So to put those stations directly in front of the houses that the populations of who they were wanting to target. There was also focus on having this difference between large coverage areas versus making sure that there's a station there. So the density versus coverage question is a big piece of internal argument in some of these systems of which piece they really wanted to focus more on. But it was also very evident that very few actually had quotas for how many stations they wanted to have in low-income minority neighborhoods. And it was, this goes back into the specificity of how exactly these systems talk about equity in their systems and what goals they want to achieve. I'm not going to read off many of these quotations, but these slides will be available online at a later time, and I do encourage you to go read them at a later point. Equity in fee structure and payment systems, there's just a lot of ways to take into account equity in these kinds of systems. So you could look at the cost of what it actually costs to use one of these bikes in a bike share system. What kind of discounts are you offering to your equity populations, and also how are you allowing your equity populations to pay for these systems? So there's a lot of systems that we're talking about offering cash options, looking at reducing credit card holds, or so a lot of systems have a credit card hold where if you go to the station and try to rent out a bike, your credit card is charged $100 as kind of a credit check, and if anything happens to the bike, you're charged that $100 kind of thing. So they were seeing that was being a barrier in a lot of cases, so many systems were finding ways around that or dropping that charge hold. There was a lot of ways that they were looking at their cost of the system. They were offering many different segmentations of price plans and how these plans were able to be paid for. So instead of having one large yearly upfront price, you could pay for it monthly. And also a matter of being able to understand what the fee structure even means. So there's a lot of, within the barriers, they were noting that a lot of their populations that they're talking to can't understand what exactly they're going to be charged for. So they try to figure out ways to make that fee structure simple to understand to the general population. In system operations, a lot of it was around hiring processes. So making sure that they were hiring a diverse staff and trying to make sure that the people that they were hiring were representative of the people that they were trying to target for their programs. There wasn't a whole lot mentioned in here, and that was evident in how many actually considered equity impacting this particular piece of their system. So fewer than half actually said that equity impacted this particular piece of their system. Equity in promotion, marketing, and outreach. This was the third largest impact for equity in the system. So a lot of systems were looking at how they were generating their marketing materials and what it is that they were trying to convey through their marketing materials and what they were doing to try to spread the message around to the populations they were trying to target. So, having Spanish translation of their marketing materials to attract Latino populations to their systems, to have people of color in the marketing and advertising that they were doing in not only just in the neighborhoods that they wanted to target, but system-wide. And, forming partnerships with nonprofits and community advocates to be able to utilize their networks to help reach those populations that they've normally not been able to reach. And equity and metrics and data collection, this was a fairly thin piece of information that we were able to get from our respondents. Very few actually had very specific metrics that they wanted to measure, and not a lot of talk around anything beyond just collecting the basic demographics. But we had some that were getting very specific in what exactly they wanted to track. So we had some that were setting the percentage of women that they wanted to have that were participating in yearly memberships, or percentage of women that were taking part in the low cost or discounted membership prices. They wanted to track their usage of low-income users and make sure that their fee structures were not heavily impacting these populations in a way that they weren't foreseeing. So having overage charges is a very common thing in these bike share systems, and these overage charges end up just getting passed onto the credit card without even really being able to see that in a lot of cases. So they wanted to make sure that they were tracking these kinds of things, and they could find some way to alleviate that concern in the future. Barriers, lots and lots of barriers. I mean, they were noticing a lot of the common barriers that we'd expect. They were generally coming into the areas of pricing and payment systems, the various aspects of access, perceptions of bike share and bicycling in general, and the awareness, education, and understanding of how these systems even work. So they were running into these problems when they were trying to do their outreach efforts of, what barriers do they have, and what barriers are their populations telling them that they have in trying to access these. So not having a credit card, or not knowing how to even use a system, not having internet or smartphone access. So there's a lot of things out there, particularly in the price realm, but infrastructure barriers also. So you place these stations in neighborhoods that don't have existing bike infrastructure, like bike lanes or bicycle boulevards or such, and you run into the same problems that you run into with trying to attract people to bike in general based on infrastructure. You don't have the infrastructure necessary to make people feel safe when they are bicycling. And complicated rental structures, language barriers, just the lack of information. A lot of these systems put out a lot of advertising and materials to help educate the people that they're trying to attract to these systems, but there's still such an education barrier to try to help these populations, or the population in general, to even understand how these systems work and what they're going to be charged, and how they need to take the bike back, rent it out, anything like that. In conclusion, equity is something that most bike share systems are thinking about. We had over 50% of our respondents said that equity was being considered in their system in some way or another. Equity statements in particular are a very huge key in being able to, make the planning efforts throughout your bike share system much more robust. So you're focusing on equity in many more pieces of your planning stage by having an equity statement. But it's not necessary in a lot of cases. They're still able to incorporate equity without having an overarching equity framework. But having one definitely helps. Biggest barriers: station siting, fee structure and pricing, and promotion, marketing, and outreach. Getting the education out to the people who want to use this or can use this to some kind of advantage. Making the fee structures, recognizable, easy to understand, and at a cost point that is equitable for these populations to be able to use. And to keep in mind that equity is a fairly new concept for many of these systems. So we don't know what the best practices are yet, and what strategies around equity are the best ones to use. So a lot of experimentation is going on right now, and as these systems continue to evolve their equity programming, we'll see some strategies fall out, some rise to the top, and that's just something that we have to wait to see what's happening and continuously evaluate what's going on. And that is it.
I was wondering where the local Nike bike system fits in all this, where they fit in terms of like how equitable are they, or are they just, because it seems that they seem to be like just located in downtown Portland.
So there is an equity program in place for Biketown. They do have discounted pass options. They expanded out to northeast Portland, specifically to target equity populations. And a lot of their equity planning is being done through Community Cycling Center. So, it does exist. How successful it is, how equitable it is, that's something that we haven't really evaluated all that much. So, that's a question that hopefully we'll have some better information on in the future. But keep an eye out for it for sure.
I had a question about the marketing outreach, the 25% that was negative view of bicycling. I wondered about our bike count program, if having the Nike brand on it makes it more appealing to, because Nike's not really seen as a bike brand, but it makes it more appealing to people who have a negative view of bike culture, and I was wondering if that came up in the study of the places that already had implemented programs.
Bike share sponsorship was not something that was specifically mentioned by any of our respondents in particular, and how it impacted their equity goals or statements or anything like that. In my own personal experience and what I see throughout equity literature and what's going on with many other systems in place is like you can have a sponsorship such as Nike, but it's going to be perceived in a different way than it would be if it was sponsored by a healthcare organization or such. So you start to see kind of the elite mechanisms in place that identify Nike with a certain kind of identity that isn't incorporated with something with a healthcare organization, for instance. So there's a lot of systems out there that are sponsored by healthcare organizations, but we don't have the information and we don't have the studies going currently to really test that kind of difference in how the sponsorships work or don't work or impact these equity goals and statements.
I sat in on a few meetings for Minneapolis when they were doing their equity statement strategy stuff, and a lot of lower-income communities really, they expressed that they did not want a bike share, that they saw it as a toy, kind of, and now it's an actual transportation mode, and that if they were getting any investment, they would prefer it to be more buses or repaving the streets as opposed to getting fun toy bikes. So I'm just wondering if, how you with the research actually address the fact that it might not be something that a lot of communities truly want.
So that's more of what's taking place in the second piece of this larger study that we're doing. So we've sent out mail surveys to over 18,000 residents in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Brooklyn combined. We've gotten about 1,800 responses from those people that are living in low-income minority neighborhoods that have had bike share installed in their neighborhood and have been exposed to some kind of treatment of an equity planning framework of promotion outreach and such. So we're getting a better idea through this piece of the study of how exactly they're perceiving bike share and whether or not they see this as a valuable piece of their potential options in transportation, and how exactly they perceive themselves using it if they are using it at all. So there's a lot of things in there, and definitely in the literature and such. This piece of of, oh, you've put in this bike share system, but the population there doesn't necessarily want this. That's a big issue that transportation in particular has been faced with for decades, because there's always this bright new idea that they want to push out to the populace and see this as a new way that we can get people to move around, but they're ignoring all the other past injustices that are going on that have been going on in these neighborhoods. So I mean, even in Portland, we've had our own controversies around the Williams bikeway in particular. They started to do all this public outreach to identify how they wanted to change this bikeway, and they got a lot of negative feedback from the neighborhood because they're like, we've been disadvantaged for decades. Why are you doing this bike infrastructure? This isn't something we want, or it is something that we'd like to have, but you've been ignoring all of our past wants for so long. Why are you doing this rather than any of the other things that we've been asking for so long? So it's definitely a concern that these agencies need to take into account. They need to do the public outreach. They need to talk to the people and get them involved in the planning stages to actually see whether or not this is something that their targeted equity populations would even want to take part in, but also to help encourage them to try it, because it may turn out to be something that they can use and can be advantageous for them. So there's a dual side there to how this all gets played out.
I'm curious what you think about mandatory helmet policies and if that is an equity issue.
Well, we haven't done anything around mandatory helmet laws in our study, but it can become an equity issue depending on the price plan around the helmets. Are you giving them out for free? Are you charging people for them? What exactly are you doing around these helmets? That's one part of the equity concerns around mandatory helmet laws. The other is, how are you enforcing this? With police tactics and what's going on in these neighborhoods, if you're more heavily enforcing these laws in low-income minority neighborhoods versus other neighborhoods, then you have an equity problem there as well. So I mean, there's a lot of things to look into on that particular piece of equity planning and mandatory helmet laws. But we don't have that study in place right now, so we can't say definitively what's going on or how it's perceived or how these systems are taking into account how that can impact equity.
Okay, if there's no questions, let's thank Travis and Steve again for the